Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our July 1st edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today we're bringing you expert insights from Iowa Farm Bureau's recent economic summit. We'll start with Washington, D.C. insider Frank Kelly, who's going to share some big-picture geopolitical factors that farmers should keep in mind as they consider the future of agriculture. Then we'll bring on Ed Usset, a grain marketing economist at the University of Minnesota, to share his strategic grain marketing recommendations for farmers. First up is Frank Kelly, who sat down with spokesman reporter Bob Bion following his fascinating presentation at Iowa Farm Bureau's 2024 Economic Summit.
Frank, what a fantastic session focusing on the world's macroeconomics, international commodities, and geopolitics. A presentation highlighting that everything, everywhere is changing all at once. From the 30,000-foot level, what does that mean? What all is changing that the agricultural community should take notice of? As you said, there are no dull moments, dull days anymore.
Yeah, there are no dull days, right? You wake up and it's just a new headline, which is not necessarily a dangerous thing, I would argue. It's just that we've become saturated with headlines of risk because that drives eyeballs and everything else. So I think it's giving a lot of people anxiety, but that's a whole separate issue. When you get down to the root of it, you're seeing these huge geopolitical shifts. China, no longer the largest country in the world. That's really stunning to think. We thought, what was it, just like a year or two ago, they're going to be the largest in the world, they're going to be the largest economy in the world, and neither is going to take place. And now we're seeing and finally paying attention to the rise of India, which is now the largest country in the world, and it's very young. You're seeing the demographic shifts in Europe, negative birth rate, positive birth rate in Africa, which is increasingly going to become important to us for critical minerals that we need for technology. So you're seeing all of those things. But again, I think you can look at the negative of China or of Russia, but also the positives of a place like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, countries with positive birth rates and growing economies that are embracing more and more free market principles. And most important, I think, for the farmers in America, trade with the U.S.
Yeah, so on the ag front, that's what we're looking at. Those are the changes we may see.
It has to happen. One, because if you're trading with the U.S., you know what you're getting. You're getting a very sophisticated agricultural system that's got all sorts of safety nets, if you will, in terms of insurance and the government working, stuff that you're not going to get in some other places in Brazil or other countries. But I would make the argument that makes agriculture as a standalone thing. I think what we're seeing is an integration of trade and security. One goes with the other. You can't separate them anymore. It's India doing more militarily with the US, with Australia, Japan, creating new alliances that are sort of like taking NATO, but then having some sort of free trade component to that. The military with free trade, that we're ensuring these things happen for our neutral national security as well as our national economic security. Very different from what we grew up with in NATO with the Soviet Union, something very different, and I think quite positive, and I think it could be very positive for agriculture in the U.S.
So you mentioned the rewiring of globalization, demographic changes, you touched on that a little bit here, a new axis of evil, and commodities becoming a driving force. Maybe we could take each of those one at a time and hit the highlights of each. Let's start with the rewiring of globalization. What does that mean?
Well, it's sort of like BC and AD. So it's BC, AC, before COVID, after COVID. And before COVID, we were talking about BC, globalization's dead and we're all becoming more protectionist and there's all these issues with China and the tariffs. Okay, that was then. And then we had COVID and post-COVID. And what we're seeing is, yes, there's tariffs on China and China's tariffs on us, which we should explore why those tariffs are there and what is China doing that is forcing us to put the tariffs. But it's that we're now creating these free market environments with these countries that I've mentioned. Mm-hmm. or regions, the EU, Australia, South Korea, Japan. Japanese Prime Minister was just here and we signed 80 new trade agreements, right? That's incredible because they are so dependent on us for their national security that they realize you can't have just national security and protectionism. They have to have free markets with that. So I think that's what's really getting built out here. And I think it's bipartisan.
Demographic changes. You talked about China and India.
You know, China is going into a spiral demographically. And this is because of the disastrous one-child policy. And now they can't get women to have children. They try and incentivize them financially. They're just not doing it. There are estimates that by 2100, we could see the Chinese population having gone between now, 2024, so basically 75 years, go from 1.4 billion people to as low as 480 million people. Within a lifetime of some Chinese, this is going to happen. And what does that say for their market? And what does it say for them culturally, their family structure? That's just devastating. And this is the focus, I think, of President Xi. Keep things together. I don't think China is going to collapse, but it's going to be tough. Whereas you've got India, which is now 1.4 billion people and is going to grow. And the average age is 33. And you're not seeing a huge outflow of Indian immigrants. You're seeing people trying to escape China. The economic development in India is breathtaking. They've built in the last 4 or 5 years 75 airports. They're going to build 75 more in the next 3-4 years. And as I like to joke, that's not for your Cessna. That's amazing. But that also means they need to eat. And they have been very reliant on Russia. They've been very reliant on Ukraine. They look to the open market. But as they increasingly integrate their national security, their military with the West, particularly the US, I think that's, again, where you're going to see the opportunity for the US farmer. And I think it's one of the reasons you're seeing the good governor of Iowa is leading a delegation to go to India, right? It's because that marketplace is opening up. And it is for India's ultimate national security, global security interests that they do more agricultural trade. You take it beyond the military, you deepen it, technology, agriculture, healthcare, mutual foreign direct investment. I think that's all coming into place. So the biggest marketplace in the world is going to become more and more open to America.
A new axis of evil. What are we talking about there?
It's kind of the weirdest thing. I'm 60 years old and we lived through the Cold War, which was the West versus the Soviet Union, communism versus free market democracy. Then we went through the last 25 years after 9/11, which is arguably something of a theological war of radical Islam trying to destroy the West. Now we're in this weird world of thuggery in large ways, right? It's kind of like a Batman movie gone weird. It's Iran, which is this brittle, brutal, dictatorial theocracy run by the Ayatollah. And who are they doing business with? North Korea. One of their biggest trading partners is China, which, how do these guys all get together and say we should do business together? Iran with Russia. They're all, this is this club. And I throw into that 100% Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela here in the Western Hemisphere, who are always creating problems and trying to make it even worse. So all these guys working together against the West. And that's the challenge. The important thing is none of those countries are growing. None of them, of course, are free markets. Their demographics are shrinking. They're brittle places where revolutions could break out. But that's what we're dealing with. But they're also very dangerous countries, too.
And lastly, commodities becoming a driving force globally.
Well, let's start with the basics. Water. Water is now an enormous demand. And a lot of this is all coming back to technology. But you see data centers popping up. I know they're popping up all over the place here in Iowa. Well, what do you need for a data center? I was with somebody last night talking about that. It's water for cooling.
Right.
They will take the oldest building, old factories, but if it's got strong water capability, they'll convert it to a data center instantly. That's one. And internationally, this is a huge problem. Droughts, etc. Second, critical minerals. The ability to access critical minerals that are used for semiconductors, for cell phones, for drones, for airplanes, electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, and where do you get them, right? Cobalt and all of these other things. And the battle out there politically, globally, for that, China, Russia, the United States, elsewhere. I'd point to Africa as, one of the most blessed places for all of that. Vladimir Putin and his intelligence people have engineered 9 separate governmental coups in African countries, all of which are immensely wealthy in critical minerals because he wants to control them. And the Chinese are there too. And then increasingly, it's going to be food and agricultural output. And as the climate changes and we're seeing the weirdnesses of the climate, it's going to impact more and more. And where are those markets most stable, able to grow and maximize production? That's going to be just as important.
So we talked about China's changing role on the global landscape and a little bit about India as well. How about Brazil and some other countries, Latin America, Vietnam, some of those other countries?
Again, this is sort of this weird, the world just changed suddenly all at once. Wasn't it a year ago, Bob? We're talking about China owns all of our treasuries. They're our largest trading partner, largest economy, largest in the world. Well, they're not the largest country in the world. They don't have the largest population, and they're no longer hold most of our treasuries. And our biggest trading partner is Mexico. And that's fascinating. Now, part of that is Chinese companies and other companies moving into Mexico, doing the production there, and selling, using that as a jump-off point. But I think that's going to be changing more and more and more as we're seeing technology being reshored or nearshored, and that would be the nearshoring, semiconductor manufacturing, et cetera. They will become more Mexican. So Mexico, they're sort of in this inflection point of tremendous opportunity, but they have the challenges of the cartels, just out of control. And how do you get them under control? They have a big fiscal deficit. They've just had an election. Fascinating to see that they elected a woman, and she's a scientist. She's a climate scientist, so she understands agriculture very well. So I think Mexico is at an inflection point, and I'm going to just root that this all moves the right way instead of the wrong way. And I think there's good cause for that. Brazil is, of course, a huge competitor in the agricultural space. And President Lula has grand aspirations for himself and for Brazil. The economic numbers in Brazil are not good. And they're really struggling. So Lula's got some huge challenges, and they have nowhere near the environmental, technological capability that the American farmer has. So yes, he's trying to sell as much soy as he can because he needs the money. And he's selling it as fast as he can to China because he wants the loans from China for infrastructure development. They will undercut people on price because they need those Chinese loans for infrastructure. But all infrastructure takes a long time to build, and if it's not there tomorrow, voters get pretty ugly, pretty angry, especially when the economy's not growing. So Brazil, I think, has got a lot of challenges. The one I'm watching for is Argentina, with Javier Milei as president. And he is crazy like a fox, and he's an absolute economic genius. And I think he's already doing it, putting them through a massive transformation economically, making them more free market, eliminating all sorts of corruption. He's a huge ally and friend of the United States, which we have not had sitting in their presidency for years, and wants to work with us. He's kicking the Chinese out, who've been in there in a dominant way. So I'm seeing some really positive things in Latin America, but worrisome things, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Brazil, I worry about. So we'll see. Vietnam is technically a communist country, but they have elections, and they're moving more and more towards a free market economy. They've been doing a lot rooting out corruption. They just went out of their way to reestablish maximum diplomatic relations with the Vatican. The Vatican just doesn't do that because they think there's an opportunity. They demand religious freedoms. And to me, that's always a bellwether of economic liberalization and free trade. And you're also seeing the US doing more and more. And the Vietnamese don't get along with the Chinese. In fact, that was China's last war, was the border war with Vietnam, I think in 1979. They don't get along. It's calm. But the Vietnamese want to be with the winners. They want to be with India. They want to be with Japan. And they want the technology to move there too. And you're beginning to see that. That's the other big piece of this, is the outflow of tech manufacturing from China in a huge way to India, to Vietnam, to the Philippines. And Vietnam is that marketplace, I think, is going to be, for a host of different sectors, including agriculture, a big positive for us.
Another important factor on the global front is the supply chain and shipping. Could you touch on that and how it relates to agriculture?
You look at what happened certainly during COVID. We saw shipping coming from China. And during COVID, the Chinese had a zero tolerance policy. And what that meant was, in a Chinese port, one crane operator gets COVID, the whole port would close for 2 weeks. Well, I think it's 7 of the top 12 or 15 shipping ports in the world are Chinese. So that's an immediate supply chain problem, which has led to this reshoring, nearshoring, free trade among our friends thing. But you also look at other critical choke points. It would be the Suez Canal, which is already being affected or threatened minimally by the war in Gaza. It's much more being affected by the Houthi rebels in Yemen, firing off missiles and killer drones at shipping that's coming around the Horn there to go use the Suez. Now they have to go all the way down around South Africa. You've got the major agricultural shipping lane through the Bosphorus, through Turkey. It's all coming from Russia and Ukraine, and if they're not destroying it all up there, it has to come through the Bosphorus. And for anybody who's never been to Turkey, to see the Bosphorus, it's stunning how narrow it is. There are commuter bridges over it. If you're on the eastern side of the Bosphorus, you're in Asia. You cross the bridge, you're in Europe. And everybody commutes back and forth. You know, you could sink one simple ship in the Bosphorus. It looks like a river running through a city. It looks like the Mississippi off of Davenport. No shipping's coming through. Mm-hmm. So another choke point. The supply chain issue is really risky here in so many ways. And in those areas that I've just mentioned, 60% of agriculture, oil, and other product transships annually. 60%. So you've got to change all of this and secure the supply chains, which is becoming more and more of a big issue for all of these free market governments that I've talked about that are working with each other, because it's not just a matter of national security, as I say, it's a matter of national economic security. And to protect the national economic security, you have to protect those supply chains and ensure globally that we can get our stuff where we need it to go. The last one I would point to is the Panama Canal, which went through a massive drought earlier this year, where we saw shipping, if I remember the numbers correctly, and somebody may hear this and correct me on it, but it was something roughly 40 ships a day would pass. And it got down to 6 or 7 because there was not enough water in the locks. So all of these things really matter, and it goes to the trade, as I say, national economic security, mutual security that we're trying to develop with all these other countries.
So internationally, what's the outlook for commodities and the import-export market, especially for the U.S. and globally?
I have to think it's positive. I have to think that, one, good thing it's an election year. And no elected official, particularly anybody running for president, wants to be on the wrong side of a farmer. But I think we also realize it's that soft weapon, if you want to call it, that we would be selling around the world that people want. And as I mentioned, India, I think that's a huge positive. My prediction, too, is we're going to be doing more outreach to Africa. We're very deficient in that. Yeah. And for the critical minerals that we need, we have to deal more with Africa. Okay. Well, Africa needs our commodities. Right. And goodness knows we've lived through the years of droughts and everything else that's been going on.
Yeah.
And they want that. And they want democracy. Again, we're deficient there. And the Russians have moved in force, 9 countries. The Chinese are there. But if you go and talk to any of these African government officials, they'll tell you very quietly and candidly, they much rather work with the U.S. because it's sustained, it's real, it grows. They're not having to have to bribe a Russian official. They're not having to be bribed by a Chinese official. And this is a marketplace that brings more to it than simple agriculture. It's education, it's travel, it's all of those things that they want. And I think that's the next big marketplace we have to really reach for.
Let's quickly touch on global conflicts, the Russian war in Ukraine, the Middle East. What are we going to see there as far as going forward affecting the agricultural markets for the U.S.?
I worry about Russia and Ukraine now that we're in the summer. The war is bogged down. Russians are losing, according to British Defense and others, as many as 24,000 men a month,
Right.
which is staggering.
Yeah.
Particularly when you think of the population of Russia is basically roughly half of what the U.S. is. But Ukraine is losing a lot of men too.
Right.
And it's a stalemate. I don't see either side breaking through. What worries me, does Putin do something to try and change that calculus? Does he go out of his way, like he has focused over the past winter, destroying the electrical grid system in Ukraine? Does he now go for the other critical food? Is it Odessa and the shipping off the coast through the Black Sea? Is he just going after actually the fields themselves and destroying them? I worry about that. And
That's a real concern.
I think absolutely.
Yeah.
And particularly he's being pressed, sanctions are tightening. And the news that came out today that the G7 leaders have agreed to start taking Russian money that has been locked up in Western banks that were frozen and giving that to the Ukrainians. And Putin came right out and said, you guys are going to be really sorry for this. What does that mean? I don't think he's going to drop a nuke. I think the worse than a nuke is creating a food crisis. Because who is the recipients of that Ukrainian food and fertilizer? And African states particularly being the biggest winners of that. Of course, Russia are huge sellers in there as well. But I don't think they can compensate. And they could create a migration crisis in Africa where you're forcing these starving people into Europe and sort of tipping the economic balance, if you will, for Europe, making it too costly for them to support Ukraine. These are things that absolutely on the mind as options for Putin. So I do worry about what happens this summer in Ukraine.
What's that mean for the U.S. and the U.S. ag economy and the U.S. farmer? How do we ward off that kind of threat?
I don't know. I mean, the good news about risk of any sort, geopolitical or just general political or economic, is if you can see it and identify it, then you can start devising ways to mitigate it. So the positive is, okay, this could potentially happen. What do we need to do?
Yeah.
The negative side of it is you don't sleep well at night. You're popping tums and you're worried. I don't know what the American farmer does. I don't know what the U.S. government does in terms of international agricultural policy of that. How do you plan for that? Yeah. You kind of have to wait to see if it actually happens.
Well, let's kind of wrap up with this being an election year. In broad terms, what effect does 2024 being an election year have on the global marketplace? What should we expect to see this year, and then maybe after the election as well for agriculture in particular?
I bill myself as not a partisan analyst when it comes to elections, because it doesn't really matter. Who cares what I think? But what's most important to the farmer and to any client or audience I talk to? Look, I think what really matters is who controls the House and Senate. And looking at the outlook for the election, I don't see sweeping victories for either party with supermajorities in the Senate or overwhelming majority in the House. So there's going to have to be compromise. We're going to have sausage-making contests, which the American public always hates. But at the end of the day, that's what the founding fathers wanted, so that we weren't just jamming everything willy-nilly through. And then, of course, it matters who wins the presidency. It's a good time to invest in Tums and other stomach ailment things. But this is the way this country's been governed, and we'll get through it.
You did mention the Farm Bill, and this being an election year. What do you think is going to happen with the Farm Bill this year? Are we going to get something taken care of, or is it going to get kicked until after the election?
It's all about timing in terms of the calendar. And I know for farmers, the calendar is every day is a work day. Not in Congress, right? I mean, we're coming up on July, so they'll be out at least 1 week of July. And then they take all of August off for the recess. And then they'll come back for a week or two in September. And then it's like everybody's hair catches on fire because now we're down to the election. And they won't be around in October. So what are we talking about? Like 3 or 4 more working weeks when you add up all the days? Now, they also will come back to work after the election. They'll tell you we're working on it, but it's a very contentious battle on Farm Bill as I'm tracking it now, and on all sorts of different things. On the climate aspects, nutritional aspects, they're just going to run out of time, and then they'll end up punting it. But there's no guarantee of that. But if you ask me to bet you $5 right now, I'd put $5 it gets punted to next year.
So another extension possibly?
Yes.
Thanks, Frank. Well, there's never a shortage of global considerations for agriculture, and that's especially true in 2024, a year where more than half of the world's population will vote in elections. If you'd like to learn more from Frank Kelly and his company, Fulcrum Macro Advisors, we've included a link to the slides that he delivered at our economic summit down in the notes for this podcast episode. Okay, let's shift gears and zoom in from global considerations to specific grain marketing recommendations for Iowa's farmers. University of Minnesota economist Ed Usset has established himself as a go-to expert in grain marketing, and we had him on hand for Iowa Farm Bureau's Economic Summit. That's where he caught up with Spokesman reporter Corey Munson.
So today I'm joined by Ed Usset, the grain marketing economist from the University of Minnesota. Can you tell us a little bit about that position as a grain marketing economist? What's your expertise and how long have you been working in this field?
Well, I kind of stumbled into it. I work in an academic setting at the University of Minnesota, but that's not my professional background. I left the university years ago and went into private business. I was a wheat buyer for the Pillsbury Company. I was a pick trader for the Pillsbury Company in the Minneapolis Grain Exchange. So my background is on the commercial side of things, and it remained that way for almost 20 years. I came back to the university because a couple of things in the milling industry. Pillsbury got out of the milling industry, so I left it too. But I found my way back to the University of Minnesota's Applied Economics Department to teach a course at night. And it just led to a full-time deal. I became an economist there and have enjoyed my time there immensely over the last 25 years.
Oh, fantastic. Well, given your long track record, what's some of the big lessons you've learned about grain marketing in that time?
I got a very popular talk I've given hundreds of times called 5 Common Mistakes in Grain Marketing. And what happened when I came back to the university in the late 90s, I was traveling around and I'm doing Outlook. The supply and demand. I had pretty charts showing exports and production. I had your typical talk, and I just felt this was not ringing true with farmers. What I did note is farmers would tell me their thoughts about grain markets, about how they worked, their biases about the way things happened in the market. And I said, I'm seeing mistakes here. And misconceptions, mistakes, errors, however you want to put it. So I'm bringing the same idea to marketing. Quit thinking about trying to figure out which way the market's going. I've got an opinion, you've got an opinion, everyone's got an opinion. And those opinions and $5 will get you a latte in the Twin Cities. My thought is eliminate the mistakes and shoot for a good average price. Just see if I can quit making that mistake and maybe I find an extra dime and not make that mistake every year and find an extra quarter, etc. Well, that's resonating. But if there's one biggest lesson, and I've been saying this for years to producers, look ahead. look and plan ahead. I have too many conversations with producers who, I've got last year's crop in the bin. I'm trying to fight last year's battle. And I'm like, that's last year. Move on. Look ahead to what's coming up.
Kind of from your perspective, what's the value of on-farm storage right now? Is that still a good thing for guys to have, to be able to store that grain to the next season? Do you want them getting rid of it as quickly as possible? Kind of what's your philosophy there?
I think on-farm storage is a wonderful thing. It's also a tool that can be abused and misused. People ask me, can my marketing efforts pay for on-farm storage? I'm not sure that it can fully. It can pay for some of it. I've got a character in my book. My book features make-believe celebrity producers. And people think, well, cartoon characters, you're trying to have fun. Well, these cartoon characters are a serious effort to illustrate ideas. And I've got one character, I think he might be the most popular, Hank Holder. Hank Holder holds his grain in storage too long. He puts it in storage at harvest and holds it right up to a week before harvest, at which time he empties the bins because he needs them for this year's harvest. Now, I know it sounds crazy, but son of God, there are Hanks out there. And all you have to do is look at a seasonal pattern in cash prices that have held true for as long as you want to go back. And that is, prices tend to be lowest at harvest and highest in the spring, early summer. And if you're holding on to your grain unpriced into July, August, September, you're just riding the wrong end of the curve. So Hank Holder, he's a testament to how to abuse storage.
So let's talk a little bit about 2024. From what you're seeing out there, what factors are really moving markets for corn and beans right now?
I'm going to throw you a curveball here, Corey. I'm going to tell you that we had quite a run-up in the month of May. Unfortunately, we backed off quite a bit from that. That run-up was led by wheat. As a former wheat buyer, I think a lot about wheat. No one in Iowa talks about wheat. I think the last couple of years have been very good years since the end of 2020, right up through 2023. I'm going to go back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And when that happened, boy, we lit the markets up. The concern was we're taking Ukraine out of this world mix. That's a big deal. But what happened over the next 2 years is Russia stepped up, and I'm not a big fan of Russia, but they stepped up with good wheat crops. So this shortage we thought that was going to show up didn't happen because Russia kept having good crops. Now, how do we get this to May? All of a sudden, the light comes on. Russia's not having a good crop this year. They're having problems. And that's a big, big issue. The U.S. has a good crop, might be an opportunity for us. But if you look worldwide at the wheat fundamentals, they're very, very tight. So wheat led it. Big helping hand from flooding in Brazil, calling into question the South American crops, the size of them, and so on. And that got us a good start, and now we're backing off pretty severely. But wheat's going to be a big player in the next year.
Are there any risk indicators that you're watching for right now, looking at these markets?
I continue to beat that drum on the wheat market. I'm watching that. I want to see how Russia's going to react. Are they really going to cut down on their exports in the year ahead? There are policy decisions out there about sustainable aviation fuel. I'm not a policy expert. I know that we are in the midst of an incredible expansion in soybean production throughout this country. It's ongoing as we go now. And I tell people, you should keep track of the comments and the thoughts of Dr. Scott Irwin out of the University of Illinois because he's keeping close tabs on this thing. A year and a half ago, I would have told you that all this expansion in soy crush capacity is going to do great things for the soybean industry. And I'm starting to rethink that. It looks to me, looking at Scott's numbers, that they may be getting out over their skis. Is that the term? Be getting ahead of the demand for renewable diesel.
What approaches to grain marketing do you advise moving into harvest season?
Well, we had that nice rally in May. First good rally we've had all year. I hope we treat this as an opportunity to get something done. Let's not just sit on our hands. I don't know if your listeners here have had that opportunity. If you didn't, and if you see a rally, get something on the books. And that old crop you got from last year, you got to deal with that. You don't want to be Hank Holder.
Do you have a price point that you're recommending right now?
Well, my price points, I start pre-harvest marketing based on production costs, and they're way above where we are right now. I think December corn is currently at $4.75, right around there. My price point was $5.50 in December corn. We're 75 cents away. We're $1 away in soybeans. That's disappointing, but that's the reality of agriculture. You don't always cover your costs. So, there are good years and bad years. We've had a couple of good ones. So don't get too hung up on production costs. You see a rally, go for that good average price and accept the fact that maybe that good average price is not quite enough to cover it this year.
At least you'll lose less than you would otherwise.
Yes. Sometimes you maximize profits. Sometimes you work to minimize the loss.
If folks want to learn more about your work or just get some advice on marketing, is there a website they can visit? Or
Center for Farm Financial Management. I post marketing plans for my pre-harvest and post-harvest marketing plans. I tee up what I've got in mind. Now, I don't have a real farm, Corey, so it's a lot easier to do it when you don't have a real farm. But feel free to look at my marketing plans. I post them up. I post how I did. I'm not always beating the market. I'm not always selling the high. I'm getting a good average price and pleased about that. But you'll find them on our website. You can only buy my book online from our Center for Farm Financial Management. And if you Google my name, Edward Usset, or the Center for Farm Financial Management at the University of Minnesota, you can find a link to my book. It is $39.95 plus shipping and handling. This third edition hasn't been out very long. We've sold over 1,000 copies so far.
Thanks, Ed. We know that our listeners can use some of that great advice to help craft and refine their grain marketing plans. If you'd like to learn more from Ed or purchase his book titled Grain Marketing is Simple, It's Just Not Easy, we've included links for you to do that down in the podcast notes. As we wind down this episode of the Spokesman Speaks, we'd like to thank all of the presenters, attendees, and sponsors who made Iowa Farm Bureau's day-long 2024 Economic Summit such a success. We've tried to give you a taste of the Economic Summit action in today's interviews, but it's impossible to pack hours of important economic analysis into just one podcast episode. With that in mind, we definitely encourage you to keep your eyes open for future Farm Bureau events aimed at positioning your farm for future success. And on that front, we have 2 upcoming events for you to consider. The first one is an Economic Outlook webinar we're offering farmers on Tuesday, July 16th. In that webinar, renowned economic forecaster and consultant Dr. Robert Deli will offer insights to help farmers navigate the current economic landscape. The second event is Iowa Farm Bureau's in-person Take Root Farm Succession Workshop for farm families, which we'll be offering on Thursday, July 25th in Johnston. That Take Root workshop will cover how to strengthen and secure your farm's future with topics such as family communication and business issues, goal setting, estate planning concepts, and more. To learn more about both events, use the links down in the notes for this podcast episode or visit iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next one on July 15th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.